My name is Kirk Dunn, and this is the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. I'm an actor, writer, and knitter, and I'm also known as the Knitting Pilgrim. I earned that title because in 2003, I was awarded an Ontario Arts Council Chalmers grant to knit stitched glass, an installation of 3 large panels designed in the style of stained glass windows, which look at the commonalities and the conflicts between the 3 Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They took me 15 years to knit. And when the project was complete, my wife Claire and I wrote a play called The Knitting Pilgrim about my experience knitting stitched glass and my research into interfaith relations. One thing that wasn't covered in the play was the meaning behind the imagery in the knitted panels. So, this series explores each section in conversation because, ultimately, the project is about having conversations with empathy and curiosity about how we understand and sometimes misunderstand each other. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. In today's episode, we'll be looking at a section of the Christian window or panel, and the overall design of these windows incorporates the major symbol of each faith into each window's or panel structure. So, for Christianity, that of course would be the cross, and inside the cross, I've placed the positive images of the faith, whereas outside the cross are the images referencing some of the challenges that the faith is dealing with in respect to its history or its relationship to the other Abrahamic faiths. And the section we're looking at today is in the bottom right of the Christian window, and it is of the Christian soldier. The Christian soldier is a bit of a paradox for me. We often hold up the soldier as having paid the ultimate sacrifice in giving their life for their country, which is a very Christian thing to do, lay down your life for one another or for another. That said, the vocation of soldiering is about as far away from the example of living that Jesus set as we could possibly get. I mean, Jesus himself lived in a country that was ruled by an occupying army, and he was not about armed insurrection or about throwing out the invaders. Instead, he talked about turning the other cheek. And if you were asked by a Roman soldier to carry his pack, which you were obligated to do, the rule was you had to do it for a mile. He said, nah, do it for 2. So in the image here, we can see a soldier wearing a crusader's tunic, which is referencing a time when some terrible atrocities were committed in the name of Christianity against both Jews and Muslims. And the soldier here is also equipped with a modern helmet and an assault rifle. Again, bringing this paradox into today's world. And our soldier is looking off in the distance, and he's not paying attention to what he's doing. And what he is doing is piercing the side of Christ with a spear, which, according to the Gospel of John, is what a Roman soldier did to the crucified Christ to be sure he was dead. And then in behind the soldier is a stylized map of the world from a board game that I used to play as a child. And the goal of that board game was world domination, which some Christians might equate to being a goal of Christianity. And so all these images with regards to the Christian soldier are there, and are things that I'm struggling with and asking questions about. And to help me unpack this paradox of the Christian soldier, I am very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Stuart McDonald. Dr. McDonald is the professor of Church and Society at Knox College, which is part of the Toronto School of Theology at the University of Toronto, where he has taught the history of Christianity for over 25 years. And where he is presently serving as vice principal and academic dean. He has researched and written in the field of the Scottish witch hunt, Canadian Presbyterian history, and has done a great deal of work exploring the changing religious demographics of Canada. And on a more personal note, back in the day, Stuart was first a camper and then a counselor at Camp Iona, which was then known as a wilderness camp run by the Presbyterian Church, and that is where we crossed paths a number of times. Stuart, welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
It is great to have you here. So, this paradox of the Christian soldier, it is probably the thing about Christianity that continues to, I continue to struggle with. And I guess my first question around this was Jesus not a pacifist?
Yes, from everything we know, he was. He did not advocate violence in any way, shape, or form. The first followers of Jesus followed that example themselves, even though the temptation would have been to try to take up arms and overthrow the Romans. But Jesus didn't do that. He was executed. He seems to have gone to that fate willingly, and he did not advocate violence. And so for everything we know, or from everything we know, Jesus was indeed a pacifist. The question that Christians have, though, is, does that mean we have to be pacifists? And that's where it's got really confusing over the years. And Christians have tended to see Jesus as advocating this. But do we? And those very verses that you quoted or referenced, where turning the other cheek and carrying the other mile, those are among the most troubling verses for Christians. Like, this is just so unrealistic. He really isn't meaning this, is he? And so there is a recognition that this is what Jesus did, but not always an acceptance that that's what we should do. And that's where we start to get that development of other understandings of how Christians should relate to war and violence.
Right. And is there then, what you're saying there is that there is sometimes, if I'm hearing it correctly, a responsibility of Christians to go to war, to fight. Is that fair?
Well, and this is one of the things that Christians have divided on. But what happened fairly early, the first Christians we know said no. But as Roman soldiers were converted to Christianity, what do, right? And as Christians dealt with the reality of taking power, essentially we start talking about when they become in charge of the Roman Empire. What do they do when there's an invading army? And so what we develop is the just war tradition. And what the just war tradition very simply says, that there are certain circumstances under which Christians may participate in a war. But there should always be a list of what those are, and it shouldn't be automatic. And also, and here's something that I think Protestants in particular have lost, after you went to war, you needed to ask God's forgiveness. It was always the lesser of two evils, and it was never a good. And if you killed anyone in that conflict, you were still expected to do your penance, to show that you felt this was wrong.
Right. Now, is there also, before we get to the place of going to war, is there also not a responsibility to do everything in our power to avoid a war? Like to be preventative in our maintenance, rather to use specifically the instance of the Second World War in Nazi Germany. I mean, we could have seen that coming on, years and years ahead, but we just did nothing about it. So, is there not an obligation to stand up early?
Absolutely, and I think that's not This is one of the things that then gets challenging, particularly taking these ideas that are very theoretical and very theological and making them work in the real world. one of my personal critiques of the just war tradition is people always justify war. And that I know what we're saying when we say it's always evil, and in circumstances like the Second World War, or circumstance where you have Viking invaders who are just killing everyone, is the use of defensive violence not acceptable? Well, you say, well, yes, it is. But all of a sudden, offense becomes defense. And
Right.
so let's attack them before they attack us. Or, well, it's not just about personal safety, it's about economic safety. Whatever the reason is, we rationalize going to war. And Christians have fallen into that trap even within the just war tradition.
Right. And is there not a paradox of, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that the Romans were converted, and was it Constantine
Yes.
who was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, who converted on his deathbed and decided, we're going to be Christians from here on in. And then Christianity, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my very basic rudimentary historical understanding is that Christianity then enjoyed a period of huge expansion there, sort of at the point of a sword. Like, they went in and conquered people and converted them, I think essentially by force to Christianity. And isn't that so I should just double check with you there. Am I kind of correct in that, or is that a misunderstanding?
There are definitely examples of that. I'm actually going to be teaching about that on Thursday. So, yes,
Okay.
there's definitely examples of that. But there's another piece of that we miss, is that trying to bring in, particularly some of the barbarian tribes that came into Europe, Christians compromised. And so they projected a god who was like a warrior god. And so when the Vikings were converted, they kept being Vikings. They were just now Christian Vikings. And so
Right.
it's not just that people were converted to Christianity. Those people who came in converted Christianity. And so the Vikings and the Germanic tribes really transformed understandings within Christianity in ways that we don't see. And that's even before we get the development of the Holy War tradition, which is so well illustrated in the panel. I mean, I think that's just really graphic, and it shows a tradition that goes even further and stops seeing this idea of war as always wrong, and says, actually, there might be times when war is right, and we are fighting on God's side. And that, I would argue, is a third tradition that is even more problematic.
Well, thank you for your words about that. And yeah, I'd like to explore that idea of a holy war. Again, those two things are they are just so diametrically opposed to the idea that something could be holy and it's about killing people. Are we seeing that kind of thought process and that kind of view more nowadays?
That idea develops in the 11th century with the calling of the First Crusade. Historians talk always about origins, and they'll say, well, we see examples of this before. Some historians see it just a natural extension of the just war tradition. I see it as distinct and separate, and that's my view as I've read a lot about the Crusades and done a lot of secondary research on them. That becomes a dominant Christian understanding right up to the end of the Second World War. And we see a lot of that in the First World War, far more than we realize. And so I think that's a long answer to your question. I think a way of saying it, it's still here, but we have more of a resurgence of other understandings, in particular, those of us who would want to claim a more pacifist understanding for the Christian faith, those of us who are troubled by this. And so I think what is probably stronger is the critique of war. And that might surprise us. But if we look at things written in the middle of the First World War, I think we would be really troubled. And so I think it continues, but these other understandings which go back to the days of Jesus, I think are coming back to us in a really helpful way.
That is some good news, because certainly looking, as I look out over social media and I look at the news and see, the rise of the right and people becoming, and it's not just the right, but people becoming more and more, extreme in their views, in their echo chambers. It just seems like we're headed back that way again. And I guess I find it pretty depressing, and I don't know what to do about that. And I don't know how to address that, and how to talk about that. I use the word pacifism, but pacifism, right, in the present day, almost has a bit of a mocking tone to it. It doesn't have a whole lot of respect. But how do you talk to people who are saying, this is what onward Christian soldiers and march to war? How do we deal with that?
I want to first begin by affirming that what you're seeing is real. We still are seeing echoes of that. And as we've lost the Soviet Union and it becomes Russia, and Russia reverts to Christianity, the Orthodox version, that militant idea is not going away. It's reinforced. So I think you're absolutely right. What I've done over the years is, when I'm teaching, I lay out these three positions to the students. I'm also very clear where I stand. That I say I am a pacifist. That's how I come at this, is why my understanding of what Jesus calls us to do. I also come from a family that has a strong service tradition in the military. And so I live with that tension. And we talk about what that means, and I think we just open up the possibilities. I think the other thing is, everyone always tells you, if you're a pacifist, those times when war might be necessary. But we need to have further conversations about what the consequences of war are. Everyone who's a pacifist gets challenged about it. But people who say, no, we should use war to achieve this or that, we don't challenge them about whether that's acceptable or what the cost of that is. I can understand, and I've had friends who've served in places like Bosnia. They did good work. They did necessary work. They tried to help people. I get that, even as a pacifist. But my question is to them, yes, we solved some problems, but did we create others? And I don't think we should be simplistic, but I think we need to ask each other what the way forward might be. And I think it's too often the pacifists are just told, you're unrealistic, grow up. Well, you're unrealistic when you talk about going to war in the First World War. It's going to be a glorious battle. We're all going to come home well. Yeah, it didn't work out. And we need to have those honest conversations.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, I liked what you said there. And I think this is something that we need to remember nowadays. I think throughout our lives, but it's particularly lacking nowadays, is that tension that you mentioned in between opposing things, and that search search for, and also the ability to dwell in the question, to not rush to an answer, to not say it's got to be one way or the other, to not say you've either got either pacifism or death and destruction. Pick one. There's so much more of a conversation in there. There's so much more of a balance and an exploration. And I think for me, that's what's lost, and that's the thing I'm trying that I was. Sorry. I guess that I'm evoking with this entire project is we don't have to rush to decisions, and let's talk about things, and let's discuss them, and ask the questions, and pay attention to the answers, and actually stay in the questions. Sometimes it's okay to stay in a question for a while.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is never going to be an easy question, but I think we have to stay there and struggle with it. I think the resolving it, and particularly resolving it and saying, no, God is on our side, and therefore we can go to war in all circumstances. That's what's really taken us down some dark roads.
Absolutely. Stuart, that is a great place to leave it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it's been great to be here. Good to see you.
If you would like to contact the Reverend Dr. Stuart McDonald, you can reach him at s.mcdonald@utoronto.ca. This has been an episode of the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. We'd like to thank the Ontario Arts Council for their support of this conversation series and their funding of Stitch Glass, and the Toronto Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of the Knitting Pilgrim Show. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this about interfaith matters, stitched glass, and knitting, please check out our episodes at kirkdunn.com or the Knitting Pilgrim YouTube channel.